So in the previous lecture, I gave you an introduction to Thomas Gray. I spoke about his years and acquaintances at Eton College, the influence that the trip on that the trip to continental Europe had on his thought and writing, and also about some of the important events in his life that culminated in him writing the elegy that you have in your syllabus. So one of the topics that I'm going to speak about today is the historical background of transition poetry. I'm hoping that you are all familiar with the term. You must be from your readings of the history of English literature. I will nonetheless give you a hint, right? Even if you don't know, you'll get a hint. But if you don't know what transition poetry refers to, you must definitely look it up and get a better idea of what it is, right? So as I was saying, I'm going to speak about the historical background of transition poetry, right? That is how Neoclassicism gradually lost its hold as Romanticism gained traction. So, like I said, I'll give you a hint. So, Neoclassicism was the dominant form of literature, right, in the 17th century and almost midway into the 18th century. But then eventually, Romanticism started gaining traction, right? And the poems that were written in the neoclassical tradition slowly became obscure, and the Romantic poets gradually became the new normal of sorts, right? So you surely know that the 18th century is often known as the century of prose and reason. um, this is the age in which neoclassicism was, like I said, in vogue, and in which romantic tendencies were dormant, if not altogether extinct, right? I'm not saying that romantic literature was not written at all in the 18th century. It was, but it was not the dominant mode, right? It may have been dormant. There are isolated instances, of course, but by and large, it was the neoclassical tradition which was in vogue, which was the zeitgeist, as they say. But however, around the middle of the 18th century, people eventually became tired of so much reasoning and logic and decorum. And gradually, cracks cracks began to emerge in the classical edifice, as it were, through which the earliest tendencies of romanticism seemed to emerge, right? I'm hoping you already know that reason, logic, decorum, these are all classical tendencies. These are all, markers of the classical tradition. And the markers of romantic tradition would be emotion, feeling, right? Wondering, all of these things. Anyway, we are going to get into a little more detail, so these things will be clearer, even if you don't know them any better. So in other words, at the start of the 18th century, neoclassicism was the norm. In other words, neoclassicism was the normal at that time. And gradually, as poets and also as the reading public were oversatiated. Oversatiated means when you eat something, let's say you're eating something you like. Let's say you're a foodie and a certain dish is your favorite. But even if it is your favorite, it's not like you can have 100 plates of it, right? at at one point you will reach your threshold, right? And beyond that, once you cross that threshold, you won't really like it anymore, even if it is your favorite dish. So oversatiated is exactly that. Satiated means fully satisfied. Oversatiated would mean that you have crossed that threshold for liking that thing, and beyond that you will actually dislike it, right? The point after which pleasure becomes pain, right? So imagine you're eating your favorite dish, and then your stomach is full. You have had the best dish of your life. You have had the best meal you have ever had, and then someone points a gun at you and says you have to eat the same dish over and over again. You have to continue eating that dish, right? So that is being oversatiated. So around the mid 18th century, poets and the reading public as well were oversatiated with all of these classical tendencies. What were these classical tendencies? There was wit, logic, reason, and decorum, right? There are other things, but these four terms essentially capture the essence of it, or the locus or fulcrum of it, right? So what are these again? Wit, logic, reason, and decorum. These are all markers of classical tendencies. The classicists or neoclassicists, um, such as Dryden and Pope, as you already know, were the high priests of neoclassical poetry or neoclassical literature. Even Johnson, whom you have read in this semester itself, you have read his London, and that is an example of neoclassicism. In fact, we are going to see Thomas Gray as a contemporary to Johnson, Dr. Johnson, but who was not doing what Johnson was doing. He was doing something else. So while Johnson was still following the classical tradition, which he seemed to admire so much and also imitate, because if you must know from our lessons on London that he was writing much of his poetry in imitation to the classics, right? Now, on the other hand, Thomas Gray, who is his contemporary, was not doing that, right? He did start off with the classical tradition, of course, but then he transitioned, right? And we are going to talk about transition a little more soon. So, as I was saying, that around the mid 18th century, people have had by then people had too much of this reasoning and wit and decorum, and even if they had liked it before, at that point they had become oversatiated, right? I hope you understood that example of your favorite dish and being oversaturated. You can also, those of you who are not able to relate with that dish example, think of it in terms of music. Say you love a song, right? A particular song you like to listen back to back. There are songs that sometimes I will listen to 5 times in a row, right? But then if you listen to the same song 200 times in a row, you will never feel like listening to that song ever again, right? That happens. That becomes oversatiated, and that is exactly what was happening in that period around the mid 18th century, when people already had classical, neoclassical poetry, neoclassical literature more generally, for nearly 100 years, and now it was too much for them. Now it was too much for the poets, too much also for the reading public, right? Because of course poets don't publish and throw them somewhere in the river and expect people to, I don't know about them miraculously. That doesn't happen. So poets write, and there is a reading public which responds to it. So naturally both are important, right? Demand and supply. So yes, as I was saying, Romanticism started to emerge at that time as an alternative and eventually became the new normal, right? Now I will again take a small detour and explain this alternative thing or new normal. New normal is a term that you get to hear a lot, particularly in light of the pandemic. We had a different way of life only, say, I don't know, 12 or 13 months earlier, right? Last year before March, things were very different. It was a different world altogether. And now, we keep on hearing phrases like new normal, which signifies what our life has become now, right? So that's the thing that happened at that time. Obviously, there was no pandemic, but try and understand the change in terms of literature, in terms of culture more generally, right? That was a cultural change. We have had behavioral and social changes over the last 1.5 years, but when I'm talking about the transition from classicism to romanticism, I'm referring to cultural changes, literary changes, of course, within that. So yes, new normal, as I was saying. And I also said I would take a short detour and talk about this alternative scenario, right? And now, uh, a lot of you, I'm sure most of you have heard the name of Bob Dylan. Bob Dylan is an example here. Obviously, there are other examples that could be given, but I believe most of you will have heard of Bob Dylan, right? Now, Bob Dylan, uh, in America in the 60s, he was this alternative figure, right? At that time, in America, popular music was, when people thought of popular music, people knew Elvis Presley, right? Or the like. Some there were other important artists, but Elvis Presley is also a name you must have heard. So I'm just using examples which you are more likely to be familiar with, or even if you are not familiar with, you can easily look them up, right? So think of this: Elvis Presley and Bob Dylan. Now Elvis Presley was in vogue, and Bob Dylan was sort of an alternative figure. He was doing a different kind of music, and eventually that gained traction. Now, did that wipe Elvis Presley altogether? It did not. But Bob Dylan also gained traction, and the type of music that he was, pioneering in, that also gained a significant degree of prominence. Now, in the case of classicism and romanticism, you'll see historically these two tendencies, uh, you know they come back, right? So when I say they come back, I mean that you'll see for 100 years the romantic tendency is dominant in literature and culture more generally, and then people get satiated and then people want change. Not only the people, but people meaning audience, but also the artists, poets, singers, filmmakers themselves want change, and then the classical tendencies seem to return, and then again after say 100 or 120 years that changes as well. In English literature that has happened so many times. So say if you begin with Shakespeare, Shakespeare was a bit of a romantic, right? And even before that, if you take Chaucer, Chaucer was quite romantic. And in between Chaucer and Shakespeare, the 150 years or so years separating Chaucer and Shakespeare, that had a bit of classicism in it. And then between Shakespeare and all of these poets that you read, again emerged this neoclassical tradition, right, where people such as Dryden, Milton, and but Milton, of interestingly, is also a romantic, right? So things do get dicey or nebulous in some cases, and like I said, there are exceptions within the tradition, but the exceptions do not dictate what the dominant mode is, right? So the dominant mode was neoclassicism, which was wit, logic, reasoning, um, decorum, all of these things. So returning back to what I was saying, the neoclassical poets such as Alexander Pope, they prized order, clarity, economic wording. Economic wording means precision, right? Use exactly the amount of words that are required, not one word more, not one word less. Logic, refinement, and decorum, right? And there's the age of Dryden or age of Pope, age of Johnson. Their age was the age of rationalism, of wit and satire. This is why you see a lot of satire being written, right? The Rape of the Lock, which is written by Alexander Pope, as you know, is a very, very famous work of satire, right? It's a mock epic, right? So it has the word mock in it when you say mock epic. So there itself, it's a satirical work. Now, these ideals of classicism um, are are in contrast, are in great contrast with the ideals of romanticism, which is what? Which is essentially an artistic revolt against the convention of the fashionable, formal, civilized, and refined neoclassicism of the 18th century. So the romantic tendency basically said, we don't want that much formality, we don't want so much civility, so much precision, so much refinery. We want things to be crude. Emotion is crude. That's why they wanted that, right? They did not want things to be picture perfect. They were not looking to do that. That is why they were less interested in meter. Am I saying they were not interested in meter? No, they took more freedom with meter, right? You will see that. And when I say meter, I mean poetic meter, right? Do not think about centimeter, kilometer, and everything else that comes with it. So you see, around this time, some of the younger poets, and I'll name a few, like say James Thompson, Oliver Goldsmith, William Cooper. Some say, I don't know what the exact pronunciation is, but William Cowper. Let's go with that. Robert Burns, and our hero, of course, Thomas Gray, were frustrated with this school of Dryden and Pope, and they are the ones who started breaking away from it. Remember, they are not romantic poets yet. Romantic poetry, romanticism as a movement, or any movement for that matter, does not take place in one day, right? you know in geology, I'm again taking a detour here, but I'm hoping that will be useful to you intellectually. So in geology, they say two types of changes are possible in the formations of in how the hills and the mountains and rivers and basically the structures on the planet Earth, they change into two ways. One is gradually and one is catastrophically. Now, any cultural movement such as Romanticism or even Neoclassicism did not happen in one day, right? So that movement needed years and decades to form. And that culminated, when you say Romanticism, you hear actually about the culmination of the Romantic movement when you talk about people like William Wordsworth, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, John Keats, and obviously Shelley, Byron, of course Mary Shelley, many of the other people you are familiar with reading in some of the papers. But remember, it's very important to note that like in geology, there are gradual changes and also catastrophic changes. In Romanticism, when the Romantic revival happened in the 18th century, it happened gradually, not catastrophically, which is to say, it did not happen overnight. It's not like people like Goldsmith, Robert Burns, and Thomas Gray, or Oliver or James Thomson, for example. It's not like they went to sleep one night as classicists and woke up the next morning and decided that from today we are romantic. It's not like that, right? So it was a gradual change. It took decades, right? So these people, the poets that I have named, Thomson, Goldsmith, Robert Burns, William Cowper, Thomas Gray, of course, our hero, these are people who were writing around the mid 18th century, right? And sometime from the 1740s through the 1770s and 80s, right? So for this 30 or 40 years, these people, nurtured this tradition, nurtured this revival of Romanticism, and that revival itself culminated with people such as William Blake, Wordsworth, Coleridge, Shelley, Keats, right? All the poets, and of course many of the novelists as well, right? Such as Sir Walter Scott. And obviously, within the Romantic movement, you have dissidents such as Jane Austen, right? So, but then I'm going too much into history. Let's come back to these movements, this Romantic movement and its comparison to the classical, neoclassical movement. So you see, as I was saying, these young poets around the 1740s or 50s, these people were too tired of this Dryden and Pope, and they started to break away from it. They said, enough of this stupid wit and reason. We are going to cook our own poetry, and we are going to pour some emotion into it, some crudeness into it, less refined, right? It has to be more from the heart. Think of it that way, because classicists were applying too much of their mind, too much wit, too much reasoning, too much precision, too much perfection, and these people were not very happy with it. They wanted things to be a bit more crude, right? So we are going to cook our own sort of poetry, and we are going to pour a little bit more of emotion and a little less of wit and reason into it, right? Now, did they calculate? Did they sit, take a notebook, sit and do math? How much reason they are going to pour? How much emotion? It did not happen that way. Like I said, it happened gradually. It happened organically, so to speak. But remember, some poets, some contemporary poets, contemporary to Thomas Gray or Robert Burns or Oliver Goldsmith, like Dr. Johnson, whom you also have read in this paper. You have read London, so you know that some contemporaries, predominantly Dr. Johnson, still preferred to remain in the old school. And again, when I say school, don't imagine a physical building. When we say the school of Dryden, school of Pope, we are referring to the tradition, right, which these people belong to. We do not mean an actual school. So school is a metaphorical term. I have seen people whenever I say metaphysical school of poetry, and someone will go like, where was this school? In London, Edinburgh, where? Right? So school is metaphorical. If you don't know it, it's high time you did. But remember that there were very few poets who set themselves completely free from the old traditional influences. As you surely know, you cannot simply break off from all the traditions of your family in one day, right? Your family will have every family. When I say your family, I'm not obviously trying to talk about one or two of you. I'm talking about every one of us. We all have our family traditions, and it's not like you can break off from that tradition in one day, right? It has to be gradual, right? Similarly, when I name these poets, when I have named Thomson or Goldsmith or Gray himself, do not imagine that these people were able to completely break free of the influence of Dryden and Pope. Remember, because these people grew up reading the poems written by Dryden Pope. Those were in vogue, like I said, right? Those were the zeitgeist. Zeitgeist. Look up the term. If you don't know the meaning, I'm not going to give you everything away. This is a homework for you. Find out what it means. So these young people at that time, they grew up reading Dryden, Pope, and other neoclassical authors, and naturally, it would be impossible to completely break free of their influence. Naturally, these people some of these people were facing both ways, looking simultaneously at the neoclassical past and the romantic future, right? And these poets are commonly known as the transitional poets. And this is a term I told you at the beginning of the class. I will give you a hint about, but now it seems I have given you, I've told you everything that you need to know in the context of this text. So these poets, they form a sort of bridge between neoclassicism and romanticism. That is, between poets like Dryden and Pope on the one hand, and poets like Wordsworth, Coleridge, and Keats on the other hand. So these people are in between, right? They are the people who brought about the gradual change. So in their poetry, you will find both classical as well as romantic elements, right? For example, you will see that Thomas Gray does use a little bit of the meters that Dryden and Pope also used. Those metrical qualities he has taken from the classicists, but then the outpour of emotion, right? The outburst, disgorgement of emotion, that is something which we see culminate or reach a greater degree of culmination in the poetry of Wordsworth or Keats. All right. Now let's talk about the place of Thomas Gray in transition and English poetry, right? Now, you know from the previous lecture that Thomas Gray was one of the most learned men of Europe of his time, right? He was also an excellent poet, but he was not very prolific. In other words, his poetic production is quite small. He wrote only a handful of odes, some miscellaneous poems, and most famous of all, the elegy. Right. So overall, despite being a very learned man and despite having excellent poetic talent, he produced very little. Right. He was not nearly as prolific as many of the other poets that you hear of. For example, I'm picking up someone not from this tradition, but take Rabindranath Tagore for example. Right, he was immensely prolific, immensely prolific. He wrote, I don't know, thousands of poems, thousands of songs, painted and wrote so many novels and short stories. You see that he was such a prolific person. Even Shakespeare was quite prolific. So many plays, so many sonnets, and some miscellaneous poems. So very, very prolific. But Thomas Gray, despite having rare talent, he did not produce as much. Now, why he did not, that is not a question that is relevant to our discussion here. So, as I was saying before, Thomas Gray is one of the best examples of transitional poets. This is because he started his career as a classicist and ended as a genuine romantic, right? So his career as a poet, stretching over say 25 or 30 years, he evolved as a poet, and despite beginning as a classicist, he ended up as a genuine romantic, right? He created the perfectly fertile ground, or the perfectly, he created the audience who would later on go on to read poems by Wordsworth and Keats and Shelley, right? So he's one of the pioneers. And his work, according to a literary critic named Hudson, is a kind of epitome of the changes which were going over the literature of his time, right? So he symbolizes all the changes that were coming to literature in the mid 18th century. So his earliest poems were very much classical in spirit, like I already mentioned, and some of them were even written in the heroic couplet. Heroic couplet is something Dryden and Pope used quite a lot. So you will have to be familiar with it if you don't know. Read about heroic couplet. And Elegy, written in the country churchyard, the poem that these lectures are all about, right, is Gray's finest poem, which earned him the praise of even Johnson, Samuel Johnson. Remember, his contemporary, but his contemporary who chose to be a classicist, who deliberately remained a classicist. So, but this poem was so good, right, that even Johnson, who was otherwise very critical of Thomas Gray's poetry, even Johnson praised it. And Hudson, the critic I named before, Hudson observes that this poem, that I'll just quote Hudson for you, right? So this is a long quote from Hudson, which I'll read out to you. So he says, Hudson says, there is first the use of nature, and remember he's talking about elegy written in a country churchyard. There is first the use of nature in this poem, though employed only as a background, is still handled with fidelity and sympathy. There is next the churchyard scene, the twilight atmosphere, and the brooding melancholy of the poem, which at once connect it with one side of the romantic movement, the development of the romantic mood, of the distinctive romantic mood. The contrast drawn between the country and the town, the peasant's simple life and the maddening crowd's ignoble strife, is a third particular which will be noted. Finally, in the tender feeling shown for the rude forefathers of the hamlet, and the sense of the human value of the little things that are written in the short and simple annals of the poor, we see poetry under the influence of the spreading democratic spirit, reaching out to include humble aspects of life hitherto ignored. Right? So that was quite a long paragraph, but I will share this quote with you, and note that Hudson, the critic, he made several observations about the poem, namely 4 observations. Right? First of all, he says that in this poem, Hudson is trying to show how this poem is distinctive as compared to the poems of his time, how it is separate, how it is different or unique as compared to all the other poems being written at that time. So he said, first of all, there is the use of nature, which is employed only as a background. But even though it is employed only as a background, it is still handled with a sort of fidelity and sympathy. Second, he says there is the churchyard scene, the twilight atmosphere, and the brooding melancholy of the poem. Right? And what does this atmosphere do? What does this ambience of the poem do? He says, Hudson says that at once this ambience connects one side of the romantic movement, right, to obviously the classical movement, right? So it bridges the two. And he also says that the third thing that needs to be observed is that there is a contrast drawn between the country and the town, the countryside and the urban side. You remember that the Industrial Revolution was only gearing up at that time. Industrial Revolution reaches, an even more important stage during Wordsworth and Coleridge's life, but in the mid 18th century, it was only gearing up. It's very early stages, right? So an important contrast is drawn between the country and the town, and the peasant's simple life is shown as separate from the madding crowd's ignoble strife in the town. So country and town, that difference is made here. And finally, Hudson says there is a tender feeling for the rude forefathers of the hamlet. Hamlet does not mean Shakespeare's Hamlet. Hamlet refers to a place in the countryside, a village sort of, and the sense of the human value of the little things that are written, in poetry, right? So these are the 4 observations that Hudson makes with regards to elegy written in a country churchyard, and I think they're very relevant. So I will share this quote with you, and definitely go through it. So overall, to wrap up, Thomas Gray transitioned these phases nicely, right? Very well, very with some finery. He kept what he believed was good in the old neoclassical tradition, but he also adventured into unfamiliar areas of poetry. So you see the perfect gradualist poet, beginning with classicism, ending up with romanticism. In particular, Gray brought back to life the use of the first person single narrator, right? For example, I'll just quote one line from the elegy: "One morn I missed him on the customed hill," right? So he brought back that I in the poem, right? I'm going to talk more about it in a later lecture. The relevance of this I persona, or this ego, right? And the problem is that in 17th century, in the neoclassical tradition, this I persona had been considered a barbarism. But Thomas Gray, sort of, brought a revolution by bringing back that first person singular narrator, right? We are going to talk more about that in the next lecture. So finally, with this elegy, Thomas Gray makes a very significant shift from the classical elegy, and perhaps inadvertently starts a new tradition. And this tradition, pursued by Cowper and especially by Wordsworth, forms a very important part of modern poetics, leading directly to the work of many modern poets, such as Wallace Stevens, and also another American poet called Edgar Lee Masters, right? So Thomas Gray is that influential. He influenced some of his contemporaries like Cowper, and Wordsworth was certainly greatly influenced by Thomas Gray. But also, Thomas Gray's influence has seeped into the 20th century as well, and a little bit perhaps into the 21st century as well, right? So, with that, I end this lecture. In the next lecture, I'm going to talk a bit more about that I persona, and also I'm going to talk about the differences between the romantic and the classical elegy, and we'll see how this, why is this so important? Why is the fact that Thomas Gray brings back the first person singular narrator? Why is that so important? Right? So these are the things we'll do in the next lecture.